High Elves have been probably one of the most requested races in World of Warcraft history, and technically Blizzard have given us something very close to them in retail, but not in Classic. If Project Camelot really is Classic Plus, and if Blizzard intends to take Classic World of Warcraft in a genuinely new direction, then suddenly there is an opportunity that hasn't really existed for 20 years. To answer a very simple question, what if the High Elves who remain Lords of the Alliance became something different? Not Blood Elves with blue eyes, not the modern Void Elves, but an entirely different branch of Thalassian society shaped by their experiences following the fall of Quel'danil. And strangely enough, some recent data mining might be pointing directly towards that, because hidden among World of Warcraft's files, data miners have uncovered something, a mysterious name, the Skyborn, and they could potentially be Blizzard's way of finally bringing the High Elves to the Alliance to Classic Plus, which is maybe not the High Elves people were expecting. Before going any further, something needs to be made very clear. We don't actually know what the Skyborn are. There's been no announcement from Blizzard confirming a playable Skyborn race, there isn't a starting zone or a racial ability list. There isn't any confirmation that Skyborn are actually High Elves, but the amount of material coming from data mining is pointing in that direction. Data miner Steven has been investigating encrypted promotional material potentially connected to Project Camelot, and the discoveries go considerably further than a few housing decorations. The first clue was in the data for patch 12.0.5, where inside the data we found 5 pieces of housing decor. They were all labelled Skyborn, and they were also labelled as elven. It was quickly determined they were part of a promotion, although we weren't sure at the time what it was. Was it for some unannounced project, or was it for something for the Last Titan? But recently, there was a mount, an encrypted mount referred to as Skyborn Cat. According to data mining, there appears to be 4 icons for the mount representing 4 different colour variations, and there appears to be something very special about this mount. The encrypted model apparently exists on retail, while separate textures have been reportedly found on both Classic and retail. But the discoveries don't end there. There are 2 encrypted transmog sets. One appears associated with something called the Shendorai, while another appears to have a more Dwarven or Adventure-inspired theme. Alongside those 2 mounts, the Dwarven Bear and, as I said, the Skyborn Cat. And then there's the Shendorai Windwell toy, 2 tabards, and then there are 2 tabards, one linked to Lordaeron, another to the Shendorai. Taken alone, they're nothing, but taken together they give us something much more substantial. A mount, housing decorations, a transmog set, and a toy. It doesn't confirm the Shendorai and the Skyborn are the same thing, but it's very likely they are. But all of this together looks like the beginning of a distinctive cultural package, and that easily could become a racial package, because giving a group its own visual identity, its own tabard, its own architecture, its own mount, is exactly the type of thing we expect when establishing a new playable race in World of Warcraft. Now, this still doesn't prove anything, these still could simply be promotional rewards. Until Blizzard actually reveals Project Camelot and what these things are, we don't know. If the Skyborn do become a playable race, the question then is, what are they? And the answer is probably in Classic Plus. And actually I think we have clues already. Given what we've seen from the data mining, and what we know from Vanilla, all of these things point to one location, the High Elves of Quel'danil Lodge. When people think about the High Elves, they naturally think about Quel'danil, Silvermoon, the Summer, and arcane magic, the enormous elegant buildings that would eventually become synonymous with Blood Elves. That isn't the only version of High Elf society that existed in vanilla World of Warcraft. There are scattered High Elves throughout the Eastern Kingdoms who didn't follow their people down the path into becoming Blood Elves, and one of those groups can be found in the hinterlands at Quel'danil Lodge. Anyone who's quested through the hinterlands in Classic has probably encountered them without thinking too much about it. It's a small High Elf settlement situated relatively close to Airy Peak, and visually is interesting, because it doesn't look or feel like Silvermoon. It looks much closer to something normally associated with the Night Elves. Wooden buildings, a rustic environment, a settlement surrounded by forests and trees rather than towers and enchanted brooms. Of course, the meta reason for this is Blizzard having to reuse Night Elven assets because they didn't have anything for the High Elves yet. Vanilla was famous for reusing assets where it could. It was a game built on a lot of time and technical strain. But regardless as to why Quel'danil originally looked that way, the result is incredibly useful for Classic Plus. Blizzard has already returned to this particular group of High Elves in Classic. In Season Discovery, Blizzard introduced a new NPC called Magister Falath, specifically titled the Quel'danil Lodge Emissary, who can be found in Ironforge. Falath explains he's travelled from Quel'danil on urgent business to petition the Paladins of the Silver Hand for assistance. On its own, it's not enough evidence to show the High Elves are becoming playable, but it does show when Blizzard began exploring vanilla again through Season of Discovery. It specifically chose to revisit Quel'danil and give the High Elves there new story content, and it actually shows them reaching out to their Alliance allies. If Season of Discovery was Blizzard's first attempt at making Classic Plus content, then it's interesting the High Elf community was one Blizzard chose to revisit, because Quel'danil provides Blizzard with a completely different High Elf culture, one that sits somewhere between both Blood Elves and Night Elves, and this is what the Skyborn could represent. Blizzard, however, needs to be careful, because if Classic Plus simply introduced playable High Elves to the Alliance, taking Blood Elf models, giving them blue eyes and putting them in Stormwind, the result would be incredibly underwhelming. But most importantly, it would undermine one of the things that makes Classic interesting: factional identity. The whole getting Blood Elves in the Burning Crusade was a massive change. If Classic Plus is meant to be an alternative timeline, then every decision Blizzard made between 2004 and today shouldn't be the same. So don't give the Alliance Silvermoon High Elves, give them the High Elves who rejected Silvermoon. Imagine following the destruction of the Sunwell and the political transformation of Quel'danil, some of the High Elves of the Eastern Kingdoms began gathering together. They arrived at Quel'danil, High Elves living among the Alliance, rangers who never returned home, mages who refused to accept the new direction of their kingdom, people who still consider themselves Quel'dorei, but increasingly realise that Quel'Thalas is no longer their home, and over time they develop their own new identity, the Skyborn. And this is where Quel'danil becomes important, because Blizzard wouldn't have to completely reinvent their culture from scratch. They would take what already exists and expand it. These High Elves have spent years living in the hinterlands surrounded by forests and mountains with the Wildhammer dwarves, and that should change them. Instead of the extravagant arcane civilization associated with Silvermoon, their settlements could be smaller and more integrated into the natural world. But unlike the Night Elves, they wouldn't reject the arcane, and that is what would make the Skyborn culturally distinctive. The Blood Elves represent the continuation of urban magical civilization. The Night Elves represent an ancient civilization deeply connected to nature and the wilderness, and the Skyborn sits somewhere in the middle. Still Thalassian, still arcane, and still descended from the Highborn, but adapted to a very different existence. Their buildings could combine elegant high elven shapes of wood, stone, and natural materials associated with Quel'danil. Their mages could use smaller arcane sanctums rather than the enormous magical towers, and their rangers could become increasingly important to their society, and their relationship with the Wildhammer dwarves could influence everything from architecture to military traditions. They wouldn't simply be High Elves who happen to live somewhere else, they'd become a population that's developed their own distinctive culture, and that's when the name Skyborn begins making a lot more sense. As I've suggested already, Quel'danil is located in the hinterlands close to Airy Peak, and this is Wildhammer dwarf country. And if there's one thing the Wildhammer dwarves are known for, it's their relationship with their griffins in the skies. So imagine what several years of close cooperation between High Elves and Wildhammer might produce. Imagine these High Elves begin developing their own aerial traditions. Maybe their rangers become aerial scouts, fighting alongside Wildhammer griffin riders. Perhaps their towns begin expanding upwards, built among the mountains along high cliffs. Elegant elven structures incorporate into the rugged landscapes of the hinterlands. And perhaps their identity with the Wildhammer gradually becomes their part of their identity. The High Elves that once looked north towards Quel'Thalas begin looking up, towards the mountains, griffins, and the sky, and suddenly those data-mined assets become interesting. Wind chimes, a wind well, and the name Skyborn itself. It begins sounding less like a completely new species of elf, and more like a name adopted by a particular High Elf culture. In the exact same way that Forsaken are still humans biologically, the Skyborn could simply be what these High Elves have begun calling themselves, not because they're magically transformed, but because they built something new. And then of course we have the mount. The fact that the data-mined Skyborn mount is described as a cat is very interesting. If the Skyborn really are intended to represent a new branch of High Elf culture, the feline mount would fit remarkably well with the identity being suggested here. One of the most recognisable parts of Night Elven culture is their relationship with the Night Sabers, enormous cats used as their traditional racial mounts. On the other side you've got the Elves of Quel'Thalas, where lynx is already native to the region and are linked with the woods of Ersong. So what if the Skyborn cat is actually a lynx? It would fit remarkably well for a people who are culturally positioned somewhere between the Night Elves and Blood Elves, and there could also easily be a story decision behind that choice. Following Arthas' invasion of Quel'Thalas, the surviving High Elves who eventually settled elsewhere would have been refugees, their homeland and population decimated, and the traditional mounts of the unicorns are long since gone. The Blood Elves would eventually take the Hawkstrider as their mount, but these High Elves are not Blood Elves. They left Quel'Thalas following its destruction, remaining loyal to the Alliance. Perhaps they looked to whatever suitable animals they could take with them. Among these creatures were the lynxes. For refugees trying to preserve whatever pieces of their homeland remains, those animals could have travelled with them. Over the following years, the lynx develops a completely different cultural significance among the High Elves of Quel'danil. Not simply an animal from Quel'Thalas, but their mount. That would reinforce exactly what makes the Skyborn distinctive. They have feline mounts which echo the Night Elves, whilst the cat itself is definitely High Elven. Not Caldorei, not Sindorei, somewhere between the two. And if the encrypted Skyborn cat really does turn out to be some form of lynx, then I'm going to feel very smug. There is another reason why this idea works well for Classic Plus. It means that Classic Plus doesn't have to pretend the Burning Crusade never happened creatively. Blood Elves are popular for a reason, that they're one of Warcraft's most recognisable races. And if Blizzard is creating a new version of Classic that continues for years, there will be the question of if the Blood Elves are going to come into the game. Giving the Alliance the Skyborn changes that conversation, because now Blizzard can allow two branches of the Thalassian civilization to evolve separately. The Blood Elves remain in Quel'Thalas, the Skyborn develop outside. the same ancestry, different experiences, different cultures, different aesthetics, and different classes. Then suddenly the question isn't why do the Alliance get whole blood elves, it's what happens when one people are divided by history. Because these groups have experienced the same catastrophe, yet responded to it completely different. One remained behind and tried to rebuild, the other has already left and gradually builds a new society alongside its allies. And this creates a lot of cultural tension between the blood elves and the Skyborn. But there's one final question that's worth considering, because buried in the data mining are things for retail. The Skyborn cat, the housing models. If these assets really are coming to Project Camelot, why does retail seemingly need its own version? Promotional rewards associated with Classic can run over into retail. It's happened before with other Classic projects. The Skyborn cat and the housing decor could simply be attainable on both versions of World of Warcraft without the Skyborn ever appearing in retail. But there is another possibility, because even if the Skyborn are being developed as a new High Elf culture for Classic Plus, there is another version of World of Warcraft where the High Elf question was never completely solved. And this is where things become complicated. Retail only has an alliance race descended from the High Elves, the Void Elves. Over the years, Blizzard have given the Void Elves additional customization options that allow players to create characters who look remarkably similar to traditional High Elves. But they still play like Void Elves given their racials. What happens if Classic Plus suddenly develops the High Elves into their own realised culture? Because now in Classic, Blizzard has something they don't have in retail, a distinct High Elf identity. But if the Skyborn proved popular in Classic, why wouldn't Blizzard bring them to retail? And actually that's a question Blizzard are going to have to answer a lot with Classic Plus. If something comes to Classic Plus and it's very popular, why do they not bring it to retail? Which means races like the Forest Trolls or the Ogres or Skyborn High Elves, they become popular in Classic or Classic Plus, and surely they have a duty to bring them to retail too. And that's the trap Blizzard are going to have to avoid moving forward, especially if Classic Plus is Project Camelot. But for now, the Skyborn remain a mystery. They could be the High Elves of Classic Plus, they could be something intended for retail too. They could be something completely different. But it is worth asking, could they finally bring High Elves to the Alliance? And if they are High Elves, should Blizzard develop them into their own culture separate from both the Night Elves and Blood Elves? Or is the Skyborn a good halfway house? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe for more Classic Plus theories in the future. Thank you for watching.